Welcome everybody. Really pleased to see people, particularly from Manchester, and I know a few people have come from over the Pennines. So typical Manchester day or evening, pouring with rain, but we love it. I'm really used to it. So I feel very sorry for those people who've come up from down south and had to get used to this. But I'm Neil McLauchlan, and I'm going to be chairing the day, and I'm really pleased to be doing this. I want to give a bit of a context as to what I mean. I'm the local director for Health Education England for the North West, and I've been chosen or asked to chair this because I've got a degree of independence, I hope, and in the conversations I've had through the PPN, which we have supported over many years, I've taken a lot of interest in mental health, in clinical psychology and psychotherapy more generally. So I feel that possibly I have an understanding, if not an expertise, in some of the issues which we might be talking about today. It's important I'm not here representing HEE. I'm here on a personal capacity, and hopefully I'll do a fairly decent job in trying to keep some order and timing. Now, in terms of the famous comfort break, the reason we're not having a comfort break is some people need to get off. So what we are doing is planning to finish at 7:45 or 7:45 in order for people who have trains to catch can make sure they get them in good time. But as Claire said, if you do need to nip out for any reason, just do so, but do it very quietly. Now, I also want to take note of all of those people who will be watching from around the country. At this point, I don't know who you are. I think we've heard Hull. I believe Plymouth might be there somewhere. But wherever you are, we hope that, one, the tech works, and secondly, that you do take advantage of the Twitter to put in any questions or comments, and we'll try and pull those together. If not, then there will be an opportunity, I'm sure, to be able to pass comments on through the PPN if you want to add anything either after the event or during it. So I don't intend to say much more at this point. What I would want to do is to make sure we have a proper debate. So I am going to be fairly disciplined. We have quite a big panel, very astute panel, and people who I'm sure will have lots to say, but I am going to be quite firm in terms of keeping to time. I want to make sure everybody has an opportunity to comment. So if occasionally I say to people, maybe somebody else needs to have an opportunity to talk, then take that in good faith. I'm not trying to be too dictatorial, but we have a relatively short time, so I want to make sure we get as much discussion and debate as possible. And in particular, I would like the audience to be able to have an opportunity to not just ask questions for panel, but to make comments, because I think it's important that we try and capture those views as much as we can. And, very pleased, we have a very good selection of people. We have trainees, we have qualified clinical psychologists, and we have some very experienced psychologists, both from practice and from an academic setting. So I hope we have a cross-section of people. So for very much it's going to work is we're going to kick off with each of the panel members having 2 minutes, which I know is incredibly tight, to do some opening comments. And then we'll have a more open debate and discussion. And when we think about what the purpose of today is, it really is an opportunity, I hope, for clinical psychologists to think about the future, think about how they are able to represent the collective view of clinical psychology, both within the broader church of psychology, but I think more importantly, out in the system. One of the issues which I've had over many years is how do we get an effective voice for psychologists, psychotherapists more generally in the world, certainly in which I work within healthcare, but I think more broadly. And I think it's really important that we're able to get that voice heard at every level of the NHS, and that's something which I'm not sure we've always been able to do as well as we could have. So I suppose if there's one thing which I'd like to see at the end of this day is that I could go to a place where I could get a really good consensual view about what clinical psychologists feel about, particularly in my case, workforce and education and training, but more importantly, how we deliver other better services for patients and clients that we work with, because that must be the ultimate aim. So that's what I'd like to take away from it. others may have a different view, and we'll hopefully begin to look at that now. So, to kick off with, and Gita does have 3 minutes because Gigi is going to talk a little bit about the PPN. So, Gita, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, okay. I'm Gita Bhutani. I'm here in my role as the chair of the Psychological Professions Network, as Neil said, in the Northwest. So just the reason I've got a little bit of extra time, but I'll try not to take it because it's a tight schedule, is just to explain a little bit about the Psychological Professions Network. It's a multi-professional workforce network which is supported by Health Education England in the North, previously Northwest. And what it does is it actually brings together psychological professionals from across the Northwest and wider who provide services in health and social care. And this includes in larger numbers clinical psychologists, counsellors, cognitive behavioural therapists, psychological well-being practitioners, and smaller numbers of other professionals such as counselling psychologists, cognitive analytic therapists, and so on, and psychotherapists. There's also trainees from across the different professions as well as assistant psychologists. And I think what's important is perhaps the context about PPN hosting this event is that our function is to promote psychological approaches to improve psychological well-being by the delivery of effective services. And we've provided a community of practice for all the psychological professions to come together in sort of multi-professional groups as well as perhaps union professional special interest groups. And I think that's supported the contribution of psychological approaches to health and social care and given us a bigger voice, at least in the Northwest, in terms of policy and service development, in terms of inputs to strategic and sort of stakeholder groups. So that's pretty much the introduction. And I think the other thing that's important to remember is that the PPN, we've got links with professional bodies who represent the voice of different psychological professions, but we're not a professional body and we don't aspire to be one. So we don't do things like setting standards or doing accreditation or anything like that. We are primarily, I suppose, looking to influence, enable and inform people about psychological approaches. So we actually really welcome strong professional voice for all the psychological professions, including clinical psychology. And over the last few years, we've seen stronger voices emerging for counsellors in healthcare and also psychological well-being practitioners across the North. But interesting, the voice of clinical psychology has perhaps become more fragmented. And I think that's a particular concern given the current professions on the NHS services and posts, as well as potential changes to education commissioning. So I think clinical psychology is a key profession in the NHS and in social care. I think its voice is important in service provision and meeting the needs of patients, service users, their carers and the wider community. And I think what PPM would like to see, or hear, I suppose, is a strong voice for clinical psychology. And I think that voice should be able to articulate the unique contribution and importance of clinical psychology interventions, the role of clinical psychology in policy, service development and evidence-based practice, addressing clinical psychology education, training requirements and developments, and addressing workforce challenges and contribute to workforce planning. So hopefully that's my 2 to 3 minutes, and I'll stop there.
Ever so slightly over, but I'll let you off. Right, so I'm going to just go down rather randomly, if that's okay. And if panel members could say who they are and what organisation they represent or what part of a profession they represent, and then kick off with the 2 minutes. And I'm looking at you, Hayley. I think you're next on my random list.
Okay, I'll go. So I'm Hayley Higson. I'm here representing Psychologists for Social Change. And in thinking about the future of clinical psychology representation, I kind of put that to the wider group. And the themes that kind of came back that are similar to what Gita was saying. People really want a profession that is headed by a strong leadership, is a dynamic, innovative leadership, but that's transparent and vocal in what they're saying, that isn't afraid to shy away from political discussion and kind of engagement with the media. And I think, that leadership, that professional body needs to go beyond lip service and kind of be committed to action and actually doing things to challenge the status quo. We do a lot of talking in psychology. I think it's about time we go beyond that. And with that, kind of thinking about NHS professionals specifically, like clinical psychologists working in the NHS, supporting them so they've got a balance in the work, so we've got the time, the capacity, the resources to engage with campaigns, to maintain relationships with marginalised groups, to engage with political, social, economic policy. other things that came out of that discussion was about sustaining links with other applied psychologists. We see that as really important because the learning that can happen between the professions. And a key kind of thing that came back from the discussions as well was that we don't want a professional body that is just interested in the interests of clinical psychology. We want a professional body that is concerned and uses evidence to advocate for and support society so that we achieve the ultimate aim, which is creating a psychologically healthy society.
Thank you very much. Good timing. Thank you, Hayley. Now, I'm really pleased that Joe's next. He's part of the group which we've been supporting through HEE and Manchester University for many years to make sure we really have engagement with the community, with users, with carers and with others. So, Joe, really welcome your thoughts.
Thank you. My name's Joe Keaney, and between 1985 and 2003, I took part in 3 different psychological interventions, and I briefly want to talk about those 3. The first, lasting a year, was group therapy with 2 practitioners working in the NHS. It was okay, but I found it a little too public, and it seemed to me to just skim the surface. The 2 practitioners, a man and a woman, were excellent facilitators. The second intervention lasted a year as well and involved one-to-one counselling with an Institute of Psychotherapists trained practitioner, again working in the NHS. It was very helpful. My male practitioner was empathetic, and I liked the face-to-face approach. His voice, which was slow and steady, very much suited me. The final, most extensive intervention lasted 5 years. It was 3 times a week psychodynamic psychotherapy with a UKCP and Institute of Group Analysts registered practitioner working privately. It was challenging. I knew it would be. I went in thinking, here at last, issues would be addressed, tackled and resolved. After 5 years, I walked away disappointed, angry and feeling more than a little cheated. My therapist seemed to think things could be resolved if only I continued to attend and keep writing out the checks. I felt our relationship was not good. I never really settled into the lying down, being addressed from behind approach. Instead of free associating, I found I was curdling into mutism, a passive-aggressive retreat from engagement. We discussed at length the possible fear I had of an authoritarian father figure and how I was turning my therapist into one. The only problem was that transference just didn't work for me. My issue wasn't with some long-forgotten figure, it was with the man, or rather the voice, behind me. And I felt he was so wedded to the transference that no criticism of him was valid. It was simply proving the transference. Money was also an issue. I fretted about the cost, but this was a red herring, a resistance strategy. All criticism could be batted back by reference to a predetermined psychological, philosophical metastructure. We were in an impasse. I felt I wasn't being listened to. Fight or flight. I chose to walk away. Were there any positives? Well, maybe the time helped me to rephrase my problem. Maybe it made me more resilient to disappointment. After such a long time in therapy, maybe life events beyond the couch had improved so that my emotional well-being improved anyway, but that it was the therapeutic relationship that allowed me to grasp opportunities I may otherwise have ignored or dismissed. Who knows? So in summary, 3 very different interventions, some more effective than others. My concern as a service user is the variety of approaches available and being sufficiently well informed as a service user in deciding which is most effective. And how can you know until you've tried?
Thank you very much indeed, Joe. That was very helpful. And I'll certainly be picking up some of those, I hope, during the discussion, some of those issues. So the next one, I think we'll look towards Alistair. Now, I know you've got a very good microphone voice, but if I could to make sure the microphone is pointed in your direction, that'd be really helpful. And as always, speak loud and clear.
Thanks very much. So I'm Alistair Duff. I'm Head of Psychology Services for Leeds Teaching Hospitals. And the 6 things I would want to see and have from our professional organisation, which I think touches into what our two previous sort of panellists have sort of put forward. One, I want a professional body that protects and supports and develops clinical psychology. We are a very versatile profession. I would argue that we're one of the most versatile professions within the mental health professions. I think we've got a 3-year basic science and we've got the art of psychological therapies. We need a voice that promotes that. We need a voice that says, how do we apply this and how do we make this theory and intervention transparent for our users? Secondly, I want a professional organisation that puts our house in order. So I'd like some transparency on nationally agreed job descriptions. I want to stop using pay grades to describe our bandings. So let's move towards early career, senior, principal and consultant psychologists. And again, it makes it transparent who's where in their career. I want a national organisation, professional body to come up with nationally agreed job plans. And those job plans are fit for purpose within a modern NHS. That's the third thing. It's got to be a professional body that aligns itself with what is really happening in the NHS. What are the challenges facing us delivering care that is free at the point of delivery in a timely way? I want a professional body that is vocal and has got fleet of foot that can respond to national initiatives. Where was the voice 6 weeks ago when the Royal College of Physicians, the Royal College of Psychiatrists said, we're very understaffed, we need more training, Department of Health is investing so much money into our profession? Where was the voice that says, we've got 200 graduates applying for every assistant post. We've got 50 assistants posts applying for every training course. And if your organisations are like mine, we've got at least 6 good candidates for every post. Invest in us. You know, as the phrase goes, we're worth it. And I believe we are worth it, but there's no voice in that. The fifth thing is I want a professional body that hosts and tolerates difference. We can't be a house that all agree all the time, so let's be proud of the fact that we are a diverse profession with unique and diverse views. In that sense, I want to borrow the European Community's motto of, we are united in diversity. And I think that's something to be very proud of. And lastly, I want a professional body that promotes educational events and hosts educational events that, again, are accessible and affordable to people across all grades. That's it.
Thank you very much indeed, and very good timing. Much appreciated. Liabo, could I ask you next?
Yeah, that's fine, yeah.
And again, could you just point the microphone?
Okay. I'm Iyabo Fatimilehin. I've been asked to join this panel because I've worked both within and outside of the NHS. I worked in the NHS for over 20 years, and I've been outside the NHS now for about 9 years. So in terms of thinking about working outside the NHS, I think one of the things I want to highlight is the diversity of that. So there's private practice as therapists or expert witness. There are private organisations that you can work for outside the NHS. There are third sector organisations. And I just want to point to a few points or highlight a few points in relation to my experience. I think there are many opportunities for working outside the NHS, one of which is that there are fewer restrictions in terms of what the evidence base is that you can use and that you can refer to in your work. There's more freedom to engage in preventative and innovative work. I mean, there's just more professional autonomy. That's been for me one of the big opportunities of working outside the NHS. So not feeling limited to a kind of stereotypically clinical, individualised approach to working with people, more opportunities to think systemically beyond individuals and families, to think about communities, extended family systems. But I think most importantly for me, it's been the opportunity for employment and to work within values-led organisations where those values are actually enacted. They're not just something that's on a piece of paper. I think the other point I want to make is that the commissioning landscape, which is what the NHS is within, has changed quite a lot in the last, 20 years or so. There are blurred boundaries that I think we need to be more aware of as a profession. There are blurred boundaries between NHS and non-NHS organisations. what used to be core CAMS work, for example, my whole experience in the NHS was in CAMS. What used to be core CAMS work is now often put out to tender and is delivered by third sector organisations, all free at the point of delivery. And I think that it's important that as clinical psychologists we're able to work in all of these settings within the NHS and beyond the NHS and make a contribution through our knowledge base and our experience. So I've also thought about the changes since I've trained many years ago. So in those days it was very rare to find clinical psychologists working outside the NHS. I remember there were rumours about, if you left the NHS within 2 years of qualifying, you'd have to pay your fees back. That was how terrible it was seen as a thing to do. But now it's extremely common. I still continue to teach on clinical courses and be involved in training. And in the last sort of 4 to 5 years, I've seen a major shift in the experience of trainees. So prior to getting onto training courses, far more of them have non-NHS experiences. Within training, far more of them have non-NHS experiences. And actually, a lot of the trainees that I've spoken to have talked about feeling that their skills and contribution were more valued in non-NHS settings than they are within the NHS. And for me, there's something about trainees having a voice in this discussion, a strong voice in this discussion, because they're at the cutting edge of the changes that are coming and the changes that are happening. I always think if we don't involve trainees in this as central to some of these discussions, without trainees, this profession doesn't have a future. So we really need to think about that. And I think the unity of the profession can't be premised on clinical psychologists mainly working in the same settings. We don't. We work in very diverse settings. And we don't all face the same issues. We don't all have the same kind of daily hassles. But I think the unity of our profession has to be based on our core and specialist psychological knowledge, our expertise, whether we're delivering individual therapies in NHS or working with communities in more collaborative and embedded ways. There's some very radical work that clinical psychologists are doing out in the community, in charities. The one that comes to mind really quickly is the work of MAC UK. It bears very little resemblance to what you would be doing if you're working with young people in NHS CAMS. So those are the points I wanted to make.
Thank you very much indeed. Welcome, Camilla. Bit of a tough journey by the sounds of it. So I've given you a bit of a break, but would you like to kick off next?
Yeah, that's fine.
Sure, yep.
Yeah. So I'm Camilla and I'm Mental Health Organiser for the BPS Minorities group. So that's aimed at pre-qualification, so trainees and below. And I'm also a first year trainee at Liverpool. And it kind of feels a tad strange sometimes representing the minority groups and their views because I'm very aware that I'm often the majority in clinical psychologists, being white, female, heterosexual and middle class. And I have lived abroad, but because of being white and so on, I've always been an expatriate, and that always has much more privilege than being an immigrant. So I guess I'm trying to capture the views of the committee, but I am aware that it is my opinions. But I think going forward for me, it's about how we ensure that the profession is as diverse as possible so that we move away from, say, all white teams, especially female teams, which is kind of often where I've worked. And I know, for example, my last role was in Harrow, which was very diverse in terms of, say, CPNs, occupational therapists. We had a huge range of backgrounds, but always the psychologists were white and female generally. I think one of the things that's really struck me as I climbed the psychology career ladder is how there seems to be a separation in terms of pre-qualified and qualified psychologists. So the minorities group is open to pre-qualifieds, but we're not open to qualified psychologists. And I think that this probably does have benefits, but I also think it kind of strikes me that sometimes we ignore the values and the contributions that assistants, trainees, and others can bring. And we, as kind of trainees and so on, almost lose the expertise of the qualified professionals. So I think for me, in the last 6 weeks of training, there's been a lot of talk about power in its various guises. And I think one of the things that's vitally important when we talk about how we're represented is, firstly, that it's aimed at all career levels, so not just, say, qualified psychologists, but also that it comes both ways. So it's not just bottom up, but it's also kind of top down, so it's kind of equal. and that kind of we think about increasing diversity and minority numbers so that it kind of becomes authentic and it's not just a tick box exercise. And I think when I was thinking about it, I was kind of thinking what sort of is particularly pertinent to those in the early stages of the career. And I guess there's the big economic side of things. So lots of talk about training being cut and how is that going to impact people. But also things like honorary posts and masters and how these are really seen to be essential to get that AP post. But these will often exclude, say, parents and carers, those who are older and so on. I think as competition for places increase, the minimum criteria also increases. And I think we'll end up in a situation where I would imagine in a couple of years' time, I won't be able to get onto training. In fact, I had to leave London to get onto training because I didn't meet the minimum criteria for any courses within probably a 2-hour radius of basically where I lived. And so I think that we've got to think about people with mitigating circumstances. Mine was because of my mental health, but, you know, people who have to work, or I did come up with another one earlier today, but, you know, there's a huge range of them. And then lastly, I think we need to be looking at kind of curriculums and just making certain that we're talking about diversity on the courses. And also thinking about like part-time courses. They don't exist. So if you've got responsibility, such as parental, you can't go on a course. And making certain that when we're thinking about the curriculums, that it's not just the norm, it is covering diversity, but it's covering it in a really authentic way so that it's not, we are thinking about the wider community and the cultures they represent, and that it's not just kind of the white viewpoint with sort of a tokenistic attribution to, say, BME and LGBT viewpoints. I mean, realistically, until this is routine, we are going to be either putting off applicants, or something that I found is that we're getting people coming in who are really trying to change things because they're motivated by the change or they're frustrated by it. I mean, I guess that's like the bottom-up perspective that I was talking about earlier. So, yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. That was really interesting. Alison, would you like to go next?
I'm Alison Clarke. I'm from the British Psychological Society. I'm a trustee because I'm chair of the Professional Practice Board. So speaking as a trustee of the Society, we hugely value the contribution of our clinical psychologist members and regard the division of clinical psychology as a core part of the organisation that will continue to play an integral part of our future. The Society is at a turning point, both in terms of its governance and its leadership, and is making changes that will have a significant impact on how it functions into the future. The ad for the new chief executive is calling, just recently placed actually, is calling for a leader to deliver the changes supported by our members in the consultations that have already been conducted and those yet to come. The new governance structures will deliver our membership's vision and strategic priorities in public affairs, education and training, practice and research. The new Senate body will introduce an effective and democratic way of selecting organisational policy priorities. This will enable us to establish a rolling programme of policy development work that brings together the necessary expertise, knowledge from our members. Our core objective is to ensure that evidence-based psychology is used to enhance people's lives, communities, and wider society. Our challenge is to make sure that our scientific evidence is applied wherever it's needed and at the right time. This includes ensuring that it is placed at the heart of government to inform and encourage effective policy making. We need to convince policymakers, funders and commissioners of the value of our evidence and our role. However, policy influencing is not a straightforward or a one-off process. It's a bit like the old Chinese water torture method. It takes dedicated time and repeated messaging to gain traction. The work of our policy unit, alongside our policy consultants in England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, is bearing fruit. In July, for example, earlier this year, facilitated by the DCP, we supported the establishment of an all-party parliamentary group on psychology, chaired by Dr. Lisa Cameron, MP, and herself a clinical psychologist, by agreeing to host the Secretariat. The parliamentarians who attended in good numbers are genuinely excited about how access to this body will support them across many aspects of their work, and not just those related to health services or specifically mental health services. I respect the frustrations that some of our colleagues have experienced and the urgent desire for change. I observe that this supertanker is turning, driven by three important things. The momentum of its established reputation with government, policymakers and commissioners, the strength that comes from the commitment and unity of its members and expert staff, and the backing of a senior management team that is being shaped to deliver our agreed priorities as a matter of urgency. As with all evidence-based practice, we are being shaped by learning from our own feedback. We have much to do, but we also have a great deal to be proud of, and we want clinical psychologists to play an active and engaged role in this, in creating the future to benefit all.
Thank you very much, and spot on timing, well done. Esther, would you mind going next?
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm Esther Cohen Tovee, and I'm currently the chair of the British Psychological Society's Division of Clinical Psychology. I'm a consultant clinical psychologist. I've got 26 years post-qualification experience. I work over in Northumberland Tyne and Wear Foundation Trust. I'm really proud to be a clinical psychologist, and I believe that our profession has contributed and continues to contribute significantly to the well-being of so many people of all ages in lots of settings, and also the well-being of their families and their partners and the wider communities. And I believe that clinical psychologists are now at the forefront of co-production, working in partnership with people who use our services, and that's going to lead to even greater benefits. I believe that we make very important contributions to multidisciplinary teamwork, to service leadership and management, to service redesign and to innovation in whatever settings we're working in. And this is particularly critical at a time when workforce, especially in mental health and learning disability services, is in a bit of a crisis. And as has been mentioned earlier, there's a real opportunity for clinical psychologists and other psychological professions to step forward and take on expanded roles and really contribute to delivering what people need. But we do live in very challenging times, and in the years of austerity, many clinical psychology posts have actually been cut, have been downgraded. In a few cases, whole departments have been axed. Some people have been made redundant or have been persuaded to take early retirement and have not been replaced. While in other areas there has been growth, welcome growth in posts, where these cuts have happened, this has led to a significant barrier to access for service users and families, and understandably has produced low morale within the profession. So I believe that it's really important that clinical psychology and clinical psychologists have really strong and influential professional representation that will ensure that the value of what we provide for people in need of our help is well known, well understood, well respected and protected. When I first joined the DCP Executive Committee, which was in 2014, I worked with colleagues to produce a statement of our core purpose and high-level objectives. We shared these with the wider representative assembly of the leads of the DCP member networks, and we shaped them up over about 18 months. And we agreed that the core purpose of the Division of Clinical Psychology is to support, promote and lead clinical psychology, working collaboratively with people who use our services and wider communities to improve well-being, and also to promote the unique contribution of clinical psychology that cannot be replicated by other approaches. And in order to deliver on that core purpose, we identified 8 high-level objectives, which I'll try to read quickly, which are to promote and develop the profession of clinical psychology and the professional voice of clinical psychology, to support the safe, effective and high-quality provision of clinical psychology, to provide support to our members and our member networks, to work in partnership with service users, carers, professional bodies, voluntary organisations and other key stakeholders, to strive to improve the well-being of the whole population through working with relevant systems and organisations, to put our own house in order, has been mentioned earlier, and to promote and develop research and theory in relation to clinical psychology. As many of you will know, we had a special general meeting of the DCP in July of this year, and at that meeting I read out these objectives to check whether these are still what our members want. There were no dissenters. I believe the profession of clinical psychology needs a strong and influential professional body which can deliver these objectives and is both resourced and empowered to do so. We then had a World Cafe-style workshop, and our members identified what they wanted from a professional body. They said they wanted that professional representation to be active, powerful, supportive, confident, public-facing, dynamic, responsive, and reflexive. And we also discussed the question of whether clinical psychology would be best represented separately or part of the wider family of applied psychologies, and there were mixed views about that point. So to conclude, I believe that the influence of clinical psychology can be strengthened through that kind of professional representation and through working with the other applied psychology disciplines and the wider psychological professions as represented through the network in the Northwest. And in terms of what would make a big difference, I think we should have a psychological professions officer at NHS England, equivalent to the Chief Allied Health Professionals Officer. And that would ensure that the role that all psychological professions can play in improving well-being are well understood, resourced and valued, and that would greatly benefit service users, families, carers and the wider population.
Thank you very much indeed. And that last point, those of you who know me, I've been rittering on for years about having representation nationally, but there you go. Nobody listens to me. Finally, but not least, Alex.
Hello everyone, my name is Alistair and I'm here representing today a group of individuals that are ex-DCP executive officers who are in the process of establishing an organisation entitled the Association of Clinical Psychologists. Now, we've heard a lot today about where we've come from, what potentially we would wish an organisation to offer their constituents. What we're talking here today about is the establishment of an organisation that could be, as Alistair suggested, fleet of foot. One of the main difficulties I think many of us have experienced over the past few years in being part of the executive within the DCP has been the very slow opportunities of turnaround that we're presented with to be able to respond most effectively, in particular around policy, around professional representation, and the ability to support members in doing the job that they wish to do. And that incorporates people, obviously, within the NHS, but also very much in a modern world today, it is not just about psychologists, clinical psychologists in the NHS, it's also outside. We need to be modernising. We need to be beginning to respond to the diverse needs of the individuals that would be members within an organisation of this nature. It's been a very difficult time for the DCP executive members. It's never been the intention to move away from the DCP and the very, very good work which the DCP executive has done. And I want to make it very clear that this is not about a divisive action. It is very much in terms of collaboration. Collaboration would be the key within ACP UK. We don't have everything set in stone. We would use a truly collaborative approach to our members, and that would be very much about establishing an election process, but at the same time offering a citizens' assembly. That would be an opportunity for people from diverse backgrounds, our constituents. That's the whole idea behind an assembly, is to have constituents coming along to talk to a newly establishing organisation to tell us, or whoever is elected into those positions, because actually that process is still to be undertaken, to be able to then take into the account the views of the people that we would wish to represent. So when we talk about a modern environment, we need to equip people to be able to respond to the needs around policies, commissioning, making sure that we equip people to be able to fulfil the function that they're being asked to do every day of the week. We are practicing psychologists, most of us, within the organisation, and most of us are doing it at our own time at this present time. Some of you will have been made aware of the organisation. We have a constitution at the moment that is again up for discussion. So I really wanted to give the idea that whilst there's been a lot of work in the background to establish the mechanisms for membership, there is also opportunities for further discussion and the ability to be able to form an organisation from the beginning. This is new. This is not going to be reinventing the wheel. It's an opportunity to take the learning from many of us that have been part of organisations previously and actually enable us to do something new and do something that's more dynamic. The difference, and this is a significant difference I think is worth pointing out, that the organisation would be a standalone organisation. Very similar, I don't know if any of you are aware of, the Association of Educational Psychologists. It is very much a professional body. It's offering the opportunity for professional representation, which I have to say I've heard a number of comments about the threats around training, threats around opportunities, and having a strong voice to be able to speak to the profession. I think there is, I'd just like to make a point that at the moment we are focusing on the needs of clinical psychologists. I think that's still a discussion to be had, whether that is the right way to go, whether it is solely around clinical psychology. But at the moment in time, we absolutely have to focus on the gap that currently exists. And that's been, as Esther mentioned, there has been motions within the DCP, and 94% of the respondents discussing the Special General Meeting motion around should there be another organisation, 94% of respondents have actually requested a new organisation, and that's what we're responding to. So it's in early days, it's a fledgling organisation. Nothing is set in stone, but at the same time, you have a group of leaders, many of whom have been DCP ex-executive members, and very much leaders of the profession, names that you would recognise. I don't want to name them, but they are there. And I think it's really important that this opportunity doesn't get lost. If we don't do something at this moment in time, there's a real danger we'll be left behind in comparison to other professions such as psychiatry, nursing, etc. So I'm here, and I'm making no excuse to the fact I'm here to sell us.
Noted. Thank you very much, everybody, and actually, we pretty well kept to time, so well done. Having listened to you, sat here, I mean, it's been quite interesting. I think what we've got are some varying perspectives, but some actually very common themes coming out from almost all of you, and I've sort of been trying to pick out some of those key words or themes, and the one which really struck me was diversity, and diversity in many different ways. So it's diversity in the sense of the people who join the profession, for representation. Are you able as a profession to draw in the right diverse communities which represent those communities you serve? That's not an uncommon problem across a lot of healthcare professions. My background clinically, I'm a nurse, and it's very interesting that the proportion of men in nursing in 2017 is exactly the same as in 1948. So some things are embedded challenges. But you also talked about diversity in the sense of what do you mean by the people you work with. So you talk about diversity in terms of clinical psychology, psychotherapy. We talk about that career pathway, you talk about trainees, you talk about psychology assistants. So you're talking about diversity in the sense that this is actually quite a varied workforce, and clinical psychologists are perhaps part of something which is bigger, and one of the challenges seems to be, well, who might you be representing in the future? Quite a lot of you talked about, I'm using the term political, but I think political in lots of different ways. So political in the purest sense, how do you influence policy? How do you make sure that the voice of psychologists and clinical psychologists is heard at every level of government and in policy making? And when we talk about that, it's also about how do you get that voice within the workplaces as well, and I think that's an equally important challenge. Equally, you talked about opportunities, and I think a lot of you took opportunities, partly in relation to the threats and some of the challenges and the difficulties we have, both with, within the profession, but I guess within services more generally, and within the NHS, and how can, as a profession, you step in to support and actually help and challenge the system to say, well, we're here, we've got lots of people who want to be psychologists. Does your career structure necessarily support that? But you are, as clinical psychologists, clearly leaders in terms of delivering psychotherapy and psychological services, and is that really being pushed in a way that it could be? And that then linked into to this wider concept of influencing and the way in which you can contribute to the development of services, of policy, and in particular, I think, the way in which you can engage with users and carers to help design those future services. I didn't think that came out as strongly as it could have. I think one or two of you brought that up, but actually, that's a bit which, for me, you're absolutely in a prime place to do, because you have the science, the evidence. Alistair talked about the art. I think that's really important. And your ability to work with people must be a way in which you can really help to influence the way in which services develop. Outside of, clinical psychology, this is about people and users and services. So I thought there was a lot of really interesting messages and a surprising amount of consensus, even through you coming perhaps from different places. And I think what I'd like to do is sort of open this up a bit. I had a few questions which came out for some of the preparation, which I will want to talk to, but we've actually got a Twitter question, and it's actually quite a relevant one. So with your indulgence, I'm going to kick off with this, and it's apparently come from somebody, Body Warriors, is that? I can't work it out, but anyway. Oh, was it? There you go. Yeah, Body Warriors 1, whoever they are. And it's a really pertinent question from what the panel were talking about, which is how do we get a more vocal presence as a profession? And I think this comes down, how can we get you heard in all the places you've talked about? Who would like to comment first? Please do, Alison. Yeah.
Very happy to go first. Being heard in high places really seems to be the thrust of that question. And this is something that the British Psychological Society has always had as a focus, but I think it's fair to say has a renewed energy around, thanks to all of those environmental difficulties to which you referred, causing the society to realise the need to modernise itself from what was designed fit for purpose in the 1960s to what it needs to be for the 21st century and beyond. Why not? So one of the strong areas of focus for the society is indeed in the policy unit, to ensure that the voice is heard. I think the experience in England perhaps is a little bit like catch-up, but certainly via our policy consultants in Northern Ireland, where I'm more familiar with on the ground, Scotland, Wales, and now with the appointment of policy consultants at Westminster, and the very swift deliverable really of the all-party parliamentary group following the engagement of the policy consultants at Westminster. We have a direct line now into the corridors of power in government. And as I said, the people who attended the launch of the all-party parliamentary group, parliamentarians of different kinds, Lords, MPs, were very enthusiastic. And what delighted me was that they saw the services that they could access through the BPS supported function at Westminster related not only to lawmaking in respect of health services and mental health issues, but indeed because psychology touches on so many areas of well-being, that is delivered or maybe yet to be delivered through national legislature, that they could see the relevance in all of those areas. I think the other huge thing, which is probably news today, is that at a recent professional practice board meeting, we received an invitation from the person who represents the allied health professions at NHS England, offering to represent psychology via her structure into NHS England. We considered the kind offer and turned it down because we felt it was at risk of positioning psychology inappropriately. And in consultation around the table, we felt that the Chief Scientific Officer might be somebody better suited to represent psychology at NHS England. And as a result of our policy unit being in touch with the Chief Scientific Officer, at a date to be confirmed in very early January, it may be the 8th, representatives of the Society will indeed meet with the Chief Scientific Officer and the Director for Mental Health Services to see if that representation, the request for which was expressed moments ago by one of my colleagues at this table, how that can be arranged and delivered. So I think it's really by using professional expertise to talk to the people who hold the power, to influence them and bring them the benefit of evidence-based research collectively from the body of psychologists. The membership of the society is the very way to do that.
Thank you. Other comments or thoughts?
Can I just respond to that? I am very aware that we already have a significant numbers of leaders sitting within positions of very strong influence, and the experience has been over a period of time that some of the work that they've wished to undertake has been, shall we say, made extremely difficult. And I would just like to suggest that the All-Parliamentary Party group was suggested some time ago. It has taken a considerable amount of time to get to this point. And I would like to suggest that we need to be a little bit more fleet of foot. In responding to suggestions, there are, as I've said, a number of people already, major leaders in the clinical psychology profession that have been working with ministers for many years. That has not been at the behest of the BPS. In fact, there's often been times when work has started and has had to be pulled because it's not been supported. So I guess what I would like to encourage is that whilst an organisation such as the BPS is a large organisation, has an enormous role to play in terms of being a learned society and being able to offer that to its members, I would like to suggest that an alternative could be that there's a professional organisation that can speak on behalf of its members and be responsive at a time when we need people in there to speak to the clinical psychology profession in it as itself. So that's what I would like to respond to that question with.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that whilst it is important to be heard in high places, it's more important to be heard in low places. Where are people speaking to people delivering services in hospitals that are poorly resourced? People at home who might be on maternity leave to escape some of these pressures. People who are tuning into this might actually be working 3 hours over their allotted weekly hours. Where's the voice there that speaks to them? There isn't anybody. And so high places, I think, is the wrong balance.
And I suppose if I can just chip in with that as well, that is something that Psychologists for Social Change have really kind of taken on board, and kind of thinking even beyond that, kind of empowering people that access services, getting the messages out to them, empowering them to speak up, to challenge the status quo, to write to their MPs, to kind of just get them going as well. I think we shouldn't neglect that in all of this as well.
So yeah, perhaps I hope is of that sort of diversity of influence and the voice being heard at every level, and certainly, where I sat, that feels very important as well. That the people I work with are able to sort of articulate that in terms of how they influence the wider workforce agenda and service development. What I'd like to do is throw this out to the audience, and I think I've got the only microphone, have I? Sorry. Sorry. I'm going to throw this out to the audience, and just has anybody got anybody want to make a comment?
Thanks very much, and thanks for calling this meeting. I just wanted to make some comments about the BPS. I suspect that I have been a member of the BPS longer than anyone else in this room, 40 years. I think the BPS has done some great things, and I have been a consistent supporter of the BPS until very recently. And like many colleagues, I've always valued the opportunity for dialogue with other applied psychologists and our academic colleagues as well. And I've always thought that that was a real benefit of being part of a generic society. However, I have come to the conclusion over many years and many bitter experiences, I'm sad to say, that the BPS is not fit for purpose in the sense of being a truly professional body in the sense that most clinical psychologists want. And I think we've already heard from, particularly from Esther, also from Alistair, the kinds of things that we expect of a professional body. And I want to argue that those things are actually at odds with the objectives of a learned society, which is what the BPS is. And I have to say I've come to this conclusion over many years of striving. And some of you will know that in 2002, 2003, I was national chair of the UK chair of the Division of Clinical Psychology. At that time, we actually ran a poll, some of you may remember it, asking people about our relationship as the DCP with the British Psychological Society. And the vast majority of people who answered that poll said that they wanted to be part of the BPS, but in a more federated way, in other words, more autonomy. There was a significant minority who thought that divorce was the best option. There was a response from the BPS at that time, and for a period of time, there was, people were walking on eggshells, and lots of things, were done to try and make clinical psychologists feel more at home in the BPS. But I'm afraid it didn't last, and that's the key thing. And it didn't last because of the fact that institutionally, the BPS is a learned society and not a professional body. And that's the fundamental point. Many of the things that I hoped for and expected from the DCP were squashed by the BPS on the grounds of ultra vires, on the grounds of it being a charity, and the objectives of this learned society were not in keeping with the very objectives that Esther has outlined.
Can I give a chance to respond, Mike?
Right, would anybody, Alison, please do.
Yeah, very much welcome a chance to respond. I think the first thing I would like to say is I come here with a great sense of empathy for the frustration, hurt and disappointment that many members of the DCP have felt, especially over the last few years. So it's not a surprise to hear what you're saying, in fact. I also come with no baggage because I'm such a recent appointee. So I became chair of the Professional Practice Board only in May and attended my first board meeting at the end of May. So I think it's quite fortunate to come with no baggage and to come with an open mind and an open heart to see what can be done, because I'm enthusiastic personally about the values that the society represents, and of course I would like everybody else to feel rewarded by their membership. I think it's fair to say, and I think it's really important to acknowledge, that there have been hurts and disappointments. I think that looking at it, coming in from my perspective, and I come in from a slightly unusual angle in that I was a management consultant for many years, and I come with all of my antenna, from that world, tweaking and observing. And I would say the first thing is that the British Psychological Society that you were faithful to for all of those years was an organisation that was probably very well designed and fit for purpose in 1960. And the circumstances, that have evolved in the world around it meant that, either it had to face up to the fact that an organisation that was fit for purpose in the 1960s isn't fit for purpose going forwards. Here we are in 2017. So at that level, I agree with you, not fit for purpose. However, what I have seen in the short time that I've been around is actual evidence of change, of a society that is really committed not only to being a very effective learned body, but also a society that's committed to serving the needs of all of its members in all of the dimensions that have been expressed in the opening statements here this evening. Of course, we can't do that without the energetic commitment and involvement of the members to ensure that they do actually get out of the society what it is they want to get out of it. And I do think that we have the momentum of the past, the momentum of the structures that are built, the momentum of the body that we already are, to carry us forward into the future. I see key personnel changes as being really significant in how things are evolving into the future. I think it's fantastic that we're recruiting a new chief executive, and we've appointed a really excellent search company to find us, an outstanding person who really will deliver the changes that are already agreed, and those that we'd like you to be involved in the consultation process next year, to lay out the changes that we want to ask this newly appointed person to deliver on behalf not only of those of us sitting in this room, but if I refer to the impact statement that was agreed at our annual sort of a meeting of trustees just over a year ago, that the society will have the following impact: that people are equipped with the everyday psychological skills and knowledge to navigate a complex world, knowing themselves and others better. Everyone can access evidence-based psychology to enhance their lives, communities, and wider society. So I think there's a great deal of work to be done, but I do think we have a great momentum behind us, and I do think it's possible, because I've seen the evidence before my own eyes of how individuals have shifted, how the direction of the Board of Trustees has shifted. I'm as distressed probably as you are at the fact that we got to this point in the first place. But I would like you to take encouragement from the evidence that I think I'm not the only person that's beginning to observe, that movement is not only possible but is being delivered. With respect to the professional body function, it's entirely true that it hasn't been the principal focus of the society. But because we're a society of members and the membership are speaking about it, it becomes a focus. And it's one of those specific areas about which a very active consultation process next year will be looking. So the opportunity exists for members to shape that professional body function within the society, just as they've contributed their energy and enthusiasm in the past.
Can we?
By all means.
Because I want to get some of the other panel to actually come in, and one which came through on Twitter, which was around how do we get fresh minds to the table, and we've got a lot of trainees, and Camilla in particular. I'm just wondering what your thoughts might be about, how do we get sort of the newer members of the profession to actually be able to influence the future.
Well, I guess for me, one of the things that I was thinking about, and when I've been speaking to a few people, is I think it's really expensive joining the BPS, and whether that's as a trainee, although apparently I found out the other day you got a discount as a trainee, which wasn't open to you as an assistant. But I never, before I joined the Minorities group, all I got was the magazines, and they were great, but that was my only availability, so to speak, to the BPS. And I think there is this separation that I talk about, and I think that the qualified people that I knew along the way were fantastic and they were brilliant, and I would follow people, say, on Twitter and so on, but I think that there is a kind of a removal, and I know I always felt very much like the assistant, and now I'm only 6 weeks into being a trainee, so I don't yet feel like a trainee, but kind of I think things like the expense and kind of what's available. So I know last year, I decided that I was going to go to quite a few conferences, but it was extortionate in terms of just attending the conferences. I don't know. I went to the DCP conference because I had a poster there, and I think I could have gone to Greece and it would have been cheaper for a week's holiday, as opposed to coming at this point to Liverpool where I didn't live. But by the time we factored in train fares and stuff like this, and for me, kind of, that wasn't something that I could do again. I think it's in Bristol this time and I won't be going. So I think it's thinking kind of firstly about the cost of it, but also whereabouts it's aimed, but how we can make it relevant, because I think there is a fantastic pre-qualified, there's a minorities group, and there are some really good parts of the BPS whereby the voices are being heard, and we shouldn't be discounting those voices because they do a really, really good job. But I think in terms of thinking about kind of the wider, profession and our voice, And I think even just going back to the first question around how can we be more vocal, one of the things that's really struck me is up until January, I was a peer support worker. So I always just said I was a support worker. And then since January, where I've sort of begun to be psychology, and then in the last week, is how many people who are just normal like shopkeepers say, oh, so you can read my minds, and they have no clue what I do. But yeah, just thinking along those kind of lines.
I mean, that's really helpful. We have some trainees, haven't we, in the audience? Would any of you like to comment, or newly qualified psychologists, about how we could perhaps get your voice more heard? Put your hand up if you... I'm not going to force you. Oh, somebody's volunteered. Can you just... I should have said, could you just say who you are? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Stephanie. I'm a second-year trainee at the University of Liverpool. Just to comment really on some of my experience, I guess. So before I started on the course, I was obviously an assistant psychologist, and I facilitated the Liverpool Assistant Psychologist group. And as a group, we actually ran a yearly conference. And it was really good. We kind of brought 100 plus assistant psychologists together, not just assistant psychologists, kind of graduates, undergraduates, psychological wellbeing practitioners, and it was always a really successful day. And in doing, when we always had support from the DCP in doing that, we had support from the University of Liverpool doing that, and I just think that could be one way that perhaps we could get our voice heard, is just all coming together and kind of talking about what it is we do want and what we want to do. Yeah.
I mean, that's really, really helpful. And I often find that actually people have to cross routes, if you like, are often the people who do drive a lot of this. And it's the enthusiasm of the enthusiasts, which is really important. And it's how do we capture that and actually use that within the profession in a more dynamic way. Because people talked about wanting something more dynamic, more responsive, and actually that may well be sat out there within practitioners and within trainees and within assistants. What I also want to just pick up, because we talked, we tend to think about this in terms of the NHS, and just in terms of your thoughts about representation. You talked about the fact that, it's another form of diversity, isn't it? The sense that we've got people working within statutory services, within private, independent, voluntary, a whole range of different places where psychologists have a role and where they can influence and where they could affect change. I'm just wondering, in terms of the way in which your community outside, if you like, of the NHS, how well that represented, and whether you think there's more we should be doing?
I think it's I think it's more of a diversity of communities outside the NHS. I think it's not one size fits all. And I think in my experience there's been a lot of tensions, if you like, a lot of assumptions made about how people can engage with what's going on in the BPS or in the profession in the same way as if they actually still worked in the NHS. So there have been assumptions, things that have been barriers for me in terms of an assumption that, I can give up my time to go and get involved in things in the BPS, and if I'm not doing that and doing it for nothing, then there's a kind of selfishness about that, because after all, aren't I getting a salary? Not actually. For many people working outside the NHS, the time is money. If you're running an organisation, then you're giving up quite a lot, not just time, money, but the kind of the thinking that you need around the organisation and developing that organisation. So I think there hasn't been enough recognition of what it means if you work outside the NHS in terms of getting involved in the BPS, getting involved in professional bodies and things like that. So I think that's been a big issue. I know there have been issues because there was an independent practitioners forum. There's a special group, I think it is, for independent practitioners. But again, there have been lots of issues around that. So one thing that came up a few years ago was the kind of moderation of the the dialogues, the conversations on that group by the BPS, and certain conversations not being allowed and being shut down, when actually they were quite critical things to be discussing if you were not in the NHS. And I think at one point the whole forum, the online forum, was shut down and taken offline by the BPS, and it felt really as if we were quite powerless in that and unable to kind of create a space for our voices. And that forum actually doesn't operate in the same way anymore. It's no longer as dynamic as it was at that time. So I think those are some of the issues for people working outside the NHS, is where do you go to get that different voice heard? How do you contribute to what's going on within the profession when the profession is seen as so closely aligned to the NHS?
Thank you, that's really helpful. Esther, I saw you nodding at times. I don't know if you want to chip in at this point.
Thank you. Yes, I was totally recognise the difficulties that you mention, and I was struck by your phrase, time is money. That is absolutely the same in the NHS. And in fact, you could go one step further and say time spent doing work with your professional body and for your professional body is time that you're not doing something else. And quite often that something else that you're not doing is seeing clients for therapy, or working with your staff team, or consulting, getting in touch with the GP about a piece of work that you're doing. All the clinical work that is done in the NHS and in other sectors is funded somehow. And in the days gone by, I think practitioners had a lot more autonomy about how they could spend their time. And it may be a model of a professional body that was based largely on voluntary contribution was viable in those days. Those days have gone. So the vast majority of people are not able to be released, either because their employer can't release them, or because they are in independent practice and they can't give that time themselves. So a model that is predicated on people volunteering and giving up their time is not fit for purpose in today's world. And that has been one of the biggest difficulties that has beset the Division of Clinical Psychology in recent years, and particularly since the British Psychological Society decided that the previous model of recompense to allow backfill to release people had to stop. So one of the things that I think we need to think about is, in order to enable anybody to contribute to their professional body and have that diversity, whether it's where you work, whether it's your background, whether it's age, or other sort of responsibilities you might have, it's crucial that any model going forward is able to accommodate everybody so that nobody's excluded. And if we have a professional body that is only viable through the voluntary contributions of people who are retired, that will not be a model that's fit for purpose. So I think you raised some really important points, but they are more general across the sectors and across different people.
Thank you. I mean, I'm probably not unique, I suspect, to clinical psychology, but perhaps sort of laid bare in this. Gita, obviously you do work with a very wide range of people through the network, as well as obviously professionally. And one of the questions which came out of the presentations was, I may have got this wrong, but there was a sense of, well, what is the workforce we're talking about here? And, what are the boundaries? Is it clinical psychology in the sense of trainees, qualified clinical psychologists? Where do psychological assistants fit in? And therefore, what about this multi-professional psychological workforce? And, maybe I'm opening up this too high, but I know it's something you've got a particular interest in.
I suppose being chair of a multi-professional psychological professions network, I suppose my view is that what we've tried to do is actually bring people together in terms of our aims are common, and that we want better psychological approaches, better psychological well-being, and we want to bring people together. There is difference, and there is difference in terms of how people practice and what they do, but I suppose one of the things I kind of see is that actually, if you look at the total number of psychological professions in the UK, it's roughly about 50,000, mixture of private practice, mixture of NHS, probably more in private, there's probably a bigger population in private practice. That's roughly the same number as junior doctors in England who were agitating for their contracts a year or so ago. We don't have that collective voice. I think that actually makes it harder for us, both as clinical psychologists but as wider psychological professionals, to actually articulate what it is that psychology can offer society. I recognise that, you know, the BPS has a broad church in terms of its view around applied psychology, but I think there's a particular need to focus on the health and social care agenda, because that is where we deliver lots of our services, whether we're in private practice, community interest companies, or in the NHS. I think we also waste our professional knowledge to some extent across all our professions, because we have no mechanism to enable people to move between and across professions. Now, I've had people have said to me, well, you're just talking about dumbing down standards, and it's like, absolutely not. But we don't recognise the experiences people have. And I was really taken with, I think, what Camilla said, which was actually a lot of the experience outside the NHS is really, really valuable, whereas assistant psychologists within the NHS are perhaps not helped or enabled as well as we could. There'll be a mixture, and that's the bit I suppose I really would like to see. It's kind of beyond the professional body argument we're here today, but it's like, how do we actually create a collective workforce voice that covers the stuff that we do?
Thank you. And just want to sort of build or extend on that. I'm probably looking at Joe and Hayley here, which is, because Hayley, you talked a lot about, you know, if you like, the social responsibilities for the profession, for instance, and that sort of wider political agenda. And Joe, you've certainly got a very clear sort of, you were clearly articulating the importance of psychologists and psychological interventions for users and carers. And it's something about how do we get those voices of the community into this debate? Because I think, you know, the risk is when you look at other professions, that sometimes that professional voice becomes the end in itself, as opposed to part of a wider responsibility to society. I don't know, Joe, have you got any thoughts or comments you know you might want to share? And then maybe Hayley, if you wanted to say a few words.
Well, I think what struck me when I was developing what I started out with was things come down to issues of power, and when if you're in a therapeutic relationship, for me what works or has worked for me is if it is an empathetic partnership. And I didn't feel in one particular relationship it was, and that's where it fell down. I loved what you were saying, Alistair, about this, you know, what about, you know, sort of not in high places, but the low places. That, you know, sort of building from the ground up seems to me important, and listening to the pain, the difficulty, you know, sort of the problems people have, and not wanting to impose, I might be saying this and it's unfair, you know, sort of somehow, you know, philosophical or psychological meta structures that seem to fit a pattern, but may not tell the story about Joe or Hayley or whoever, yeah? And I think that's the sort of, I suppose that for me is what I'd like to say this evening.
Thank you very much indeed. Hayley?
Yeah, I think I've got similar thoughts, Joe, and I think like we've talked a lot about grassroots and kind of working on that, I'm not sure like hierarchical things, but on that bottom level. And I'm just thinking actually about how we, sorry, my mind's gone a little bit blank, how we kind of mobilise people, how we get that psychological knowledge out there, but we take a step back from that, kind of break down the barriers and give people the ability to speak up for themselves. I think it's that's a responsibility as a profession to enable people to do that. I think that as a profession we've got barriers up, we can be a little bit inaccessible to people. The language that we use, that's not always the most accessible for the people that we're working with. I think we need to think about all these things to enable us to really, truly kind of develop that therapeutic relationship with people. I think we need to be supported to do that and given free rein so we can work with people, we can collaborate with people and mobilise them to achieve that common goal of the psychologically healthy society.
I mean, that's really interesting. I've just had another Twitter one, which was how do we make spaces like this safe for people who don't know much about professional bodies? And actually I thought that was really quite a fundamental question. We assume that people understand what professional bodies are there for, what they do, and of course they do vary. because you have professional bodies who act as, in some professions, as trades unions almost. That's their primary function, or certainly a significant part of their function, right through to Royal Colleges, which are really around driving standards and education. But interestingly enough, many, particularly the medical Royal Colleges, are incredibly political as well. So they have that quite sort of odd relationship. They're not a trades union, but they're incredibly political in terms of the messages they come out. So, I just wondered in terms of that question about, how do we make, in a way, this is about how do we make professional bodies accessible to the wider body. And I'm just wondering who would like to maybe just throw in. I think Esther, I see you again nodding away. So
Thank you. The reason I'm nodding about this is a question actually Gita and I have been contemplating for quite some time about how do we try and make what we do, what we're about, what we offer really accessible to anybody. And it's partly about being a professional body, but the main thing is it's about the whole purpose is to be able to offer something that's useful to people out there and be a force for good within our society. And Gita and I have a proposal to develop what it's called a comprehensive model of psychological services. And we didn't mean a model in any kind of academic sense, but just a way of trying to get across who the psychological professions are, particularly clinical psychologists, because that's where we're coming from, what we do, how we can help different people in all sorts of different settings in different ways, both through working with people individually, directly, themselves, with groups, with families, or working through the system, working through offering supervision to colleagues, working to help improve services, working in partnership with people who use services. And that project has been delayed very substantially in the system, I would say. But I'm very pleased to note that we are about to get some funding to actually take that project forward. But I think it does speak to the fleet of foot question that we've been trying to do this. This project has been in the system for, I think, maybe 3 years, and we're just at the point of having found a mechanism to award some funding to enable us to take that forward.
Can I just add one thing to that, just as a very brief comment? Part of the development for that project was a very co-produced model with one of the experts by experience, and I think we ran a workshop for engaging with community and service users, and the title was Abandon the Acronyms, Drop the Jargon and Say What You Really Mean, and I think that really was the essence of what we were trying to do with that project.
Alison, do you just briefly,
Gita's cue and say what I really mean. And just before I do, may I just correct something? Forgive me for a split second. Just to say the Practitioners Forum was shut down not because the Society isn't interested in creating fora for people to engage with one another, but because of real risks of slanderous comments and clients' details becoming public. So I just didn't want that to hang out there unaddressed. Saying what I really mean, I've already put my hands up, my personally innocent hands up, and I'm not the only person who would be saying what he or she really means in this context. Completely sympathise with all of the frustrations people have had, and I can only say to you, and your ears may be bored listening to it, so for that I also apologise. There is a massive atmosphere of change in the British Psychological Society at present. There are many more than I who have been frustrated, Esther, as you have been frustrated, and who are as desirous as you and I are of seeing the kind of changes that you want to see. And that is why certain things are being unlocked, I suppose, and that you're finally beginning to see the doors opening on that project that is dear to your heart. Because actually what that project is really core to the very impact that the society as a whole wants to have. So it would be a crying shame if it didn't have the light of day and the opportunity to really come into its full capacity. The society is full of human beings, and human beings continue to do what human beings have always done, and that is often to get in their own way. You know, it takes something for people to really focus behind a common objective. It takes the common desire. I think that is present. It takes personnel and resources lined up to do it. I think the resources are there to do it. And I think that what is happening in the society is that key personnel changes are kind of closing the door on the past and at the same time opening the door to the future. And that's not to disrespect anybody who was a part of the past. There was a time in the society in its relatively recent history where being risk averse was absolutely essential, because there was a financial pinch point some years ago that had to be addressed, and it was addressed so meaningfully that we can now afford to put that very risk averse past behind us and invest in the future and put resources behind bringing about the things that our engaged members want to bring about. May I just also quickly address the issue of recompense. Recompense is probably one of the ugliest tombstones that will be visible in the society's history for many years to come. The issue that the clinical psychology division the reason why the division has not been satisfied on the issue of recompense is not in any way down to any unwillingness on the part of any officer of the society. It is the double jeopardy of the government's attitude to charities having been woken up thanks to the episode at Kids Company and the national embarrassment that was, alongside the issues of regulating employment.
Can I just speed you up a bit, because
yeah.
we're running out of time.
So very quickly, the society bent itself into shapes left, right and centre looking for a way to address this, thought it had a solution and was advised by lawyers that that solution wasn't going to work. And even as somebody bringing my management consulting head looking for a solution, I have to say that inside the charitable structure there isn't a way to pay any member of the society to do governance work for the society. So that means chairing meetings and things like that. That does not mean that there is no way to pay for people's professional time to bring their professional competence to bear on agreed projects of limited duration, and that definitely exists. The society is not interested in strangling itself and its objectives by being pedantic.
Yeah, so it's a bit, we got out, because literally we're out of time. Very quickly, Alistair, but I just want to make sure the audience has... No, go, please.
Alison, I understand you've come new into this position, but it really sounds quite desperate. It sounds very desperate. And it feels like somebody who's trying to make amends, having said sorry too many times. And I think we're fed up of hearing sorry. We're fed up of hearing we're going to change. I'm so proud to be a clinical psychologist, but I was never more ashamed of the BPS, and I left at the first opportunity. And I've not seen any change or movement or heard any real motivation to change until now, when there's a big move to leave. So no wonder the oil tank is changing, because it's getting a bit lighter, I think, and a bit easier to shift.
Well, if that's a comment perhaps to take away. I know you want to step back, but I really am conscious that we run into... I do want to make sure that nobody in the audience... Laura, you want to say something?
I'll be brief. Okay, thank you. So I'm Laura Golding. I'm Programme Director of the Doctorate in Clinical Psychology at the University of Liverpool, and together with a number of people I've helped to organise this evening. My preference is to look to the future, but I can't just get away with not saying the following, which is an ex-trainee introduced me to a quote that I use often, which is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think organisational culture is key. And Alison, I believe you believe what you're saying, but I feel the more I've listened, and based with a lot of prior experience of the society, that it's always jammed tomorrow, that past behaviour predicts future behaviour, and unless there is a sizable change in organisational culture, it will continue. And so I feel it's really important that there's a call for actually looking forward and listening to the voices of the newer members of the profession, people coming into it, and a much more diverse range, including those who've never been part of the society or the division, because it's just not been for them and not helped them to do the things they came into the job to do. So.
Thank you. Anybody else who would like to make a comment before we... No? Okay, it's not proposed. Oh.
Is that allowed? Can I make a comment? So I'm Claire Bagley. I'm the Programme Manager of the Psychological Professions Network and work with Gita. And I guess I'm not a clinical psychologist, but one of the things that I've observed through trying to develop the Psychological Professions Network and where it sits in the structures locally is that for me, I think there's a disconnect between national drivers, policy, strategy, which is incredibly important, but actually implementing it on the ground. Things are happening now. So whilst the tanker's moving, you really need a lot of kind of lifeboats going out, because there are lots of calls out there. And I think that that's certainly something that we've tried to continue to develop within the Northwest and through the network, haven't we? And I think even with the structures that we've had and the opportunities we've offered, it's been really difficult to get clinical psychologists to come together with that voice. Other professions, like PWPs, for instance, have been fascinatingly on their front foot because they've had nowhere to, they're building their platform and they've been hungry for it. And we've moved forward some really quite innovative and quick programs very quickly. So I guess it's just a comment about this national versus the local. The local stuff is going on here and now and it's working at a pace. So I think you need both.
Thank you, and I'm sorry, if I'm having to rush things through, but we are approaching the time when I know people probably want and need to get home. So what I'd just like to do is, if each person on the panel, what struck me was, and I will go back to what I heard at the beginning, what actually you have in common seems, I still think, more than what you have which isn't in common. And I guess there's something around how do you take that forward in terms of getting that professional voice, which seems to be universally the aim and the ambition to be heard at every level of society, both politically but also in terms of professionally. So I'm just wondering if you could just maybe give me two things, 2 words, 2 very quick sentences which you just want to take home as something that you want to think about, reflect on, and perhaps share at a future discussion. So I'm going to start at the bottom. Hayley, what 2 things would you take away from today?
I'm thinking the proof is in the pudding, so to speak. I think there's a lot of talking, a lot of talk about change, but until we actually see the change, I think a lot of us are going to be in the middle and on the fence and undecided about what we do in terms of the future representation of clinical psychology.
Thank you. Alistair?
I think the time's come to set up a new association. I think that it will be a hard sell at the moment because we'll be asking for memberships where it's very difficult to actually deliver anything other than a committee and a constitution. So it's a bit of a leap of faith, but there's enough people that are like you at all levels that are going to work to make this work.
Okay. Alex?
We've got to change. Doing the same things again doesn't work. It needs to change. We need a professional body that can speak for the profession and also take into account its constituents. So the idea of an assembly that incorporates the constituents from the grassroots right the way through and being fleet of foot. So there's a lot in there, but that's my thoughts.
Okay. Joe?
As a constituent then, everyone can access psychological services. Oh, if only that were the case. I'd love that to be true. And time with clients. That's the most important time. Not time in meetings, time with clients.
Thank you very much. Gita?
I suppose what I've taken away is actually hearing a lot of what's been said about power and how power operates within our different environments, whether in terms of what Joe said at the beginning or other things. And there's something I want to reflect on in terms of how we engage with the wider workforce and the diversity within that workforce, including the psychology graduates and others, in terms of we're not supporting them or engaging them, and that's what I want to take away.
Alison?
I think what I'd like to take away is the feeling from the folk in this room that they would like to see this fleetness of foot from their membership organisation, the opportunity to publish academic papers, for example, brought to the Board of Trustees in June. The first funded publication was already in September. I observed fleetness of foot. I'm quite clear that you equally need to observe fleetness of foot, and I'm looking forward to sitting down in front of you at some future occasion when you're able to say to me, yes, indeed, we notice it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alison. A real challenge. Thank you. Esther?
I think the main thing that I am taking from today is how good it has been to have a platform on which such a diverse range of perspectives could be heard, and the opportunities afforded by the way the event has been organised to have people who couldn't be here input to it as well. I would like to assure those people who may not yet have had a chance to have their voice heard that the DCP is organising engagement events throughout the UK as far as possible, so there will be other opportunities for people to come forward with their views. And the other thing I want to be really clear about is I don't want this to sound like a lot of self-interest. The point of supporting the profession is because we really believe that we can offer genuine benefits to an awful lot of people out there, and that is the whole point of this. So it is not about self-interest. Obviously, we do want to keep our jobs, that's kind of reasonable, but the reason we exist is to serve others, and that is what fundamentally this is about.
Thank you. Yeah, Bo.
Okay. I think just to follow on for that, because self-interest is one of my concerns with what we're talking about, and I know that clinical psychology is seen as a very elitist profession. It's difficult to get into. You have to have a huge amount of resource, as Camilla talked about, in order to get into this profession and succeeding in it. And so for me, one of the things I'm thinking is about, we're talking about representing grassroots people. Are we in a position, how are we going to put ourselves in a position to do that in a genuine way without actually our voices overriding those voices of the people that we're supposedly trying to represent? That's a real concern for me. The other thing that I'll be reflecting on is my ambivalent attachment, I would say, to the BPS. I've been a member for over 30 years. I weathered my membership through what for me was an incredibly traumatic experience when there was a publication, some of you might remember, of a very racist sort of piece of research. I think it was in the 1990s, and I managed to overcome that because there were certain things within the BPS that I valued at that time. So I feel like this is really making me think about that and what does membership of the BPS mean to me personally. And also, sort of finally, just thinking about what would be ideal. I probably need to understand a bit more about professional bodies myself and professional representation. And I think the challenge is how one body will represent the diversity of issues that we've talked about tonight. I think that is a huge challenge, and I don't know if it's possible, but that's one of the things I'll be reflecting on.
Thank you. And last but definitely not least.
I think when I met with Steve, just after I started at Liverpool and we were talking about tonight, I think I said I'm a first-year trainee and I know nothing. And I still feel I don't really know much about like professional representation. I feel like I know a little bit more after tonight, and I guess that's one of the things I'm going to take away. I don't think I really knew much about the ACP before I started at Liverpool and kind of agreed to come tonight. And I think I'm probably one of the constituents because I think the ACP is going to be focusing on qualifieds. But also thinking about how we can kind of, the minorities group, we are part of the BPS currently, and that's not, as far as I know, got any plans. The BPS don't have any plans for that to change, so we'd be under them. But kind of how can maybe we have an influence on, if the ACP was to form, you know, kind of that side of it. But also just thinking about the grassroots side of things, so, you know, is it Psychologists for Social Change? You know, that side of it. So kind of, yeah, just everybody. I think it's your point that there was stuff that kind of went through all the talks that I had that was very similar, as well as differences.
Thank you very much. I'm going to wind up because we're almost at for time, 5 minutes. Obviously, I'm here listening and actually learning a lot about psychology. I'd like to think I sort of vaguely knew a bit about it, thanks to the likes of Laura and Gita and others who have educated me over the last God knows how many years. But what's always struck me about clinical psychology is the quality of the education and training, the way in which you're able to bring
forward. I mean, I think, as Alistair said, both the science and the art into the care that you provide for the people that you serve is something which has been incredibly strong. I will go back to what I said at the beginning. It is a voice which I really struggle to hear outside of forums like this. And what I've heard, as Camilla already pointed out, is so much of the same messages coming out from all of you. And it feels that this is about how can you galvanise that and how can you bring that together to form a way in which you can be heard and represented at every level, whether that's through one organisation, 2 organisations, 20 organisations. That's not for me, that's for the profession to work through. But the diversity of where you work, how you work, the types of people you care for and work with is also incredibly important. You work from people from grave to grave. You provide services in a lot of areas where you're dealing with the most vulnerable people within society. And I just think that there's something about galvanising some of the energy, which the panel certainly presented. Sometimes some of the tensions, actually, but that's fine. That's all about getting debate. And actually, I would encourage, to an extent, constructive tension, because it will help to change. But I think the most important thing, which I think struck me about today, is there's a real enthusiasm from some of the people within the profession which needs to be heard. I think Camilla's articulated it. Joe certainly put a perspective in terms of the community, and I think some of the others, in terms of some of the critical questions and others, really suggest that there's an energy out there to help. Whether it's you or whether it's wider, and the comments you made about the way in which grassroots, I almost call it activism. It's about how do you get people to work within their own communities of practice. It can also help galvanise this. So I think, I'd like to think that you're going to go away and you're going to reflect and you're going to build that energy and that enthusiasm and find a way forward. And I think the offer of further discussion, further meetings, I know certainly for DCP are interested. I know BPS would certainly want to be doing that. But I think also some of the other organisations representing the ACP and psychologists for community concern. So there's a lot of different groups. I don't think that matters if you can come together in terms of providing a coherent, common professional voice. And I said it's not my job to say how you're going to do that, but I think you need to go away and really reflect and work together to try and find a way to do that. I'd like to be able to, I've not got long left in my career, if they ever let me go. But I'd like to think if there was one thing which I came back that before I retired, that I would recognise a coherent, strong voice at both a local and a national level for, I would say, for the broader psychological family, but certainly for clinical psychologists. So I would just like to, first of all, thank the panel. I mean, that's been a really interesting evening, and I don't give up my evenings easily. So, it was worth my while. And, if we could just sort of thank the panel, please. I'm sure I know some of you have to go, but for those of you who don't, do sort of hang around and have discussions and arguments and so forth. And I'm sure any of the panel who aren't rushing off would be more than happy to talk to any of you. So thank you again. And anything else I need to say? Oh.
Should I? So I just want to say on behalf of everybody here, everybody who's joining us everywhere else, the panel, the PPN, just a huge thank you, Neil, for chairing it as well as you have and being so readily willing when you were asked if you would do this. Oh, I thought we asked. Yeah, thank you very much.
And that just reminds me, actually, if there's just one thing I would like to say, one critical question we couldn't answer, but I think you all have a responsibility for, which is how do you increase diversity in your profession? Please take that home. That's critical. Thank you very much.